Good evening, brave souls. I'm Grim, and tonight I'll be your companion through the shadows. Together, we'll dive into stories that grow darker with every whisper. So, get comfortable if you're ready. The night is only just beginning. The entrance to the pyramid loomed before them, a shadowed opening in the desert heat. Hannah, Jackson, and their tour group stood at the threshold, excitement blending with an uneasy curiosity. They'd explored many pyramids that day, but this one, set apart from the main path, looked different, smaller, almost forgotten, as though hidden on purpose. "This one's not on the tour map," Jackson said, glancing back at their guide, a local named Amir. But Amir had already turned his gaze away, muttering something they couldn't understand. "Just be quick," he replied, not meeting their eyes. "Stay together. Don't go too deep." And with that, he stepped back, letting the group go ahead. Hannah felt a strange thrill as they stepped into the pyramid. The air turned cooler, heavy with the scent of age and dust. Hieroglyphics covered the walls, illuminated by beams of sunlight trickling in from narrow slits in the stone. "Look at these markings," Jackson whispered, brushing his fingers over the carvings. "They're incredible." But as they moved further in, the excitement quickly faded. The passage twisted, sloping downward, guiding them into the earth. The walls began to narrow, the air thickening, making it hard to breathe. Hannah swallowed, feeling a chill creep up her spine. "Does anyone else feel like we've been walking in circles?" "Maybe we missed a turn," someone suggested, trying to sound casual. But their voices carried an edge of fear, a subtle tremor they all felt but didn't want to admit. They retraced their steps, or at least tried to. Every passage led to another chamber, each almost identical to the last, filled with relics, crumbling statues, and sarcophagi. It was as if the pyramid itself was shifting, leading them deeper, away from the entrance. "We should have been out of here by now," Jackson muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled out his phone, but the signal was gone, the screen casting a dim, eerie glow that barely cut through the darkness. Just as they turned another corner, Hannah's breath caught in her throat. There on the wall, a fresh set of hieroglyphs. But these weren't ordinary symbols. They were different from any others they'd seen. Jackson squinted, running his fingers over the carvings. "These weren't here before." "What do they mean?" Hannah asked, her voice shaking. Before Jackson could answer, they heard a distant echo, a low, hollow sound, like a drumbeat or a heartbeat, echoing through the stone walls. It was coming from deeper within the pyramid. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, filling the silence with an unnerving pulse. It felt alive, as though the pyramid itself had a heartbeat, a steady thrum calling them forward. Jackson grabbed Hannah's arm, pulling her along. "Let's go back. We'll find another way out." But the passages only led them deeper. Each chamber was a mirror of the last, filled with the same eerie artifacts. A broken urn, a crumbling statue, a faded mural. It was as if the pyramid was playing tricks on them, pulling them in circles. Then they noticed something strange. The air felt colder. Hannah shivered, her fingers brushing against her arm, which prickled with goosebumps. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the shadows. In the faint light, she saw shapes etched onto the walls, figures half hidden, watching them. They weren't normal hieroglyphs. They were darker, twisted, eyes that seemed to follow their every move. What are those?" Jackson's voice wavered, his face pale. The shadows seemed to grow, stretching and shifting along the walls. The carved eyes blinked, watching them with an unnatural intensity. "Keep moving," Hannah whispered, fear twisting in her stomach. They hurried forward, barely able to see, the echoes of footsteps and heartbeats mixing together, creating a symphony of terror. Suddenly the floor shifted beneath them. Hannah stumbled, her hand grabbing onto Jackson for balance. "Did you feel that?" "It's like the ground's breathing," Jackson replied, his eyes wide. The walls seemed to tighten around them, pressing closer. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. Every step felt heavier, as if they were walking through water. "Where is everyone else?" someone in their group finally asked, their voice choked with fear. They realized, with growing horror, that they hadn't seen the others for some time. It was as if the pyramid had swallowed them whole. Then, in the faint light of their phones, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A set of footprints leading further into the depths. But these weren't fresh prints. They were ancient, as though left by someone who had been here long ago and had never found a way out. Panic set in. Jackson pulled at the walls, scratching at the stone. "We have to get out of here." Hannah held him back, her own hands trembling. "No, we need to stay calm, retrace our steps." But the labyrinth didn't make sense. Every turn led to the same chamber, the same haunting eyes watching, whispering words none of them understood. Then they noticed something new, a faint writing on the wall, freshly scratched, as though someone had carved it in desperation. "Beware the unending pyramid." A chill ran down Hannah's spine. She looked at Jackson, eyes wide. "What does it mean?" Jackson swallowed, his face pale. It's a warning. This place, it's designed to trap us, forever." The heartbeat grew louder, pulsing through the walls, matching their own frantic pulses. Shadows crept along the ground, snaking toward them, wrapping around their feet. No, this can't be happening," Hannah whimpered, struggling against the shadows that felt like cold fingers pulling her down. "Don't look at them," Jackson shouted, his voice shaking. He yanked her away, running down the passage, but the shadows followed, twisting and shifting, whispering secrets in a language older than time. They ran, hearts pounding, desperate to escape. Every turn led to another passage, every step echoing the same heartbeat. They were trapped, caught in the pyramid's endless maze. Just as Hannah thought she couldn't run anymore, they stumbled into a chamber unlike the others. In the center lay an ancient altar, covered in dust and adorned with crumbling statues. On the altar, a faded map of the pyramid lay spread out, marked with symbols and pathways. Jackson's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope sparking in his gaze. This might be a way out," he whispered, grabbing the map. But as soon as his fingers touched it, the chamber grew darker, the heartbeat louder, deafening. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around them, pulling them back. The map crumbled in Jackson's hands, dissolving into dust. The walls seemed to close in, pressing them tighter, crushing the air from their lungs. In the final moments, Hannah looked into Jackson's eyes, fear reflected in both their gazes. They understood now. The pyramid was alive, feeding on their fear, their desperation. It was an ancient trap, a prison without end, and they were its latest victims. As the darkness closed in, the last thing Hannah heard was the echo of that heartbeat, pulsing through the stone walls, an endless rhythm that would keep them company, forever. The warning sign loomed before them, but as soon as Tom saw the dimly lit passage stretching into the shadows, he couldn't resist. "Come on, one quick look. They're probably just trying to scare us," he whispered to his friends, Sarah and Luke. They were exploring one of the lesser-known pyramids, and this passage, roped off and marked "No Entry," seemed far more interesting than the main tour. Sarah hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. then ducked under the rope with the others. Their footsteps echoed in the tight, cool passageway as the air thickened, carrying the scent of ancient dust and something damp, like the inside of an old tomb. At the end of the hall, a strange light shimmered. It was a room unlike any they'd seen. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling mirrors, each bordered in gleaming, age-tarnished gold. In front of each mirror stood a statue, human-sized and cloaked in robes that looked almost lifelike. "Whoa," Luke breathed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's like a fun house." But the room felt anything but fun. As they moved further inside, their reflections multiplied, twisting and stretching in every direction. The statues, each identical, held a curious expression on their faces, a mix of calm and knowing. Sarah glanced around uneasily, her reflection multiplying in dizzying rows. "Maybe we should head back," she said, her voice wavering. "Just a minute," Tom said, stepping forward. "I want to see what's at the end." He moved deeper into the mirrored maze, and Luke followed. Sarah reluctantly trailed behind them, her stomach knotting with unease. Every step felt slower, heavier, as if the room itself resisted their presence. After a few minutes, Sarah noticed something strange. The reflections were different. In some mirrors, her face looked normal, but in others, her eyes were narrower, her smile sharper, almost sinister. "Tom, Luke, something's wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. But when they turned to look at her, their faces in the reflections seemed equally strange, distorted, as if they were wearing masks of themselves. "This place is freaking me out," Luke muttered, reaching for the exit. But as he tried to leave, he gasped, finding himself facing yet another mirror. The exit was gone. "What? How did we get turned around?" he stammered, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. The mirrors around them seemed to shift and pulse, their reflections growing clearer and more distinct, almost like they were real. Sarah took a step back, heart pounding, as her own reflection leaned forward, a cold, knowing smile spreading across its face. "They're moving," she whispered, unable to tear her gaze away. "What do you mean?" Tom asked, his own voice shaking. But when he turned to his reflection, he saw it too, his double grinning back at him, lifting a hand in a gesture he hadn't made. Panic clawed at his chest as his reflection mouthed words he couldn't hear. Then, slowly, it began to step forward, pressing against the glass as though trying to escape. "Run!" Sarah screamed, grabbing Tom and Luke's hands as they bolted toward what they thought was the exit. But every corner led them to another wall of mirrors, each more distorted, each reflection more alive, more menacing. The statues seemed to move as well, their stony gazes following them, filling the room with an unspoken tension that thickened with every step. Luke stumbled, his hand brushing a mirror. His reflection reached out, grasping at his hand through the glass, its face twisted with a strange hunger. He pulled back with a yelp, and they all backed away, hearts racing. "We have to find a way out," Tom shouted, panic making his voice crack. He tried to shatter a mirror, but the glass didn't budge. Instead, his reflection smiled wider, a cold and mocking expression that sent a shiver down his spine. The reflections began to move on their own, imitating them with eerie precision, then slowly diverging, smiling when they were scared, laughing when they were silent. Sarah clutched her chest, feeling the terror seep into her bones. "They're trying to take our place," she whispered. The reflection's eyes gleamed with an almost human malice. Her own reflection pressed against the glass, its hands splayed out as if reaching toward her, its lips moving in a silent chant. Suddenly, Sarah realized that each mirror seemed to reflect not just their images, but their very souls, capturing bits of their fear, their confusion. The reflections grew stronger, more vivid, as if feeding off their emotions. "We have to stay calm," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "If they're taking our fear, then we can't give them any more." Tom and Luke nodded, though their faces were pale. They held hands, taking slow, steady breaths, forcing themselves to look into the mirrors without fear. The reflections paused, watching them with dark, calculating eyes. The air grew heavier, colder. Sarah felt a strange pull, as though something from the mirror tried to reach her. She focused on her breathing, refusing to let her fear show, even as her reflection's face twisted with frustration. Then she noticed something. At the far end of the room, one mirror was cracked, the only imperfection in the hall. It shimmered faintly, as though beckoning them. "That mirror!" she gasped, pointing. They ran toward it, dodging the hands of their reflections that clawed at the glass, pressing against the mirrors to try and trap them. Sarah reached the cracked mirror first, her heart hammering. She placed a trembling hand against it, feeling a cold pulse beneath her fingertips. She pushed, and the glass gave way, opening to reveal a dark passage behind it. "Come on!" she shouted, pulling Tom and Luke through the opening. Just as they squeezed through, the mirrors around them shattered, filling the air with a deafening noise as the reflections screamed, their cries fading into a low, guttural hiss. They stumbled through the passage, their bodies trembling, barely able to believe they'd escaped. Finally, they emerged into daylight, stumbling into the main part of the pyramid where they had started. The other tourists were there, looking at them with confusion and concern. "Where have you been?" a guard demanded, his brow furrowing. "That section is off limits." The three of them exchanged a look, unable to find the words to explain. Sarah turned back, her gaze lingering on the shadowy passage they had just escaped from. And then she saw it, her reflection in the cracked mirror at the end of the hall. It was still there, smiling faintly, a hint of malice in its eyes, as though waiting for the next visitor to venture too close. The guard moved to rope off the passage, but Sarah knew that wouldn't be enough. Some things, once awakened, could never be sealed away completely. They walked away, the eerie feeling following them like a shadow. And every time Sarah looked into a mirror after that, she couldn't shake the feeling that her reflection was watching her with just a little too much interest, waiting for the right moment to step out. It was supposed to be the highlight of their trip, the day they would step foot inside an ancient, untouched Egyptian tomb. For Emma and the group of tourists, it felt like walking into history itself. Their tour guide, Khalid, led them through a narrow passage carved out of stone, his flashlight illuminating hieroglyphs that glowed eerily in the dim light. "Here lies the tomb of Ka-Aten," Khalid announced, his voice echoing against the ancient walls. "A place of mystery, even for us locals." The air was stale, thick with the scent of ancient dust and secrets. Emma's skin tingled as they entered the main chamber, a dark, cavernous room with walls covered in intricate carvings. As the group scattered, marveling at the artwork, Emma caught sight of something strange on the wall, a series of symbols that looked oddly fresh, like they'd been recently scratched into the stone. "Khalid, what do these mean?" she called out, pointing to the strange hieroglyphs. But there was no reply. She looked around. Khalid was gone. The group huddled together, voices hushed as a chill of fear settled over them. "Did anyone see him leave?" someone whispered. "He was right here," said an elderly man, gripping his wife's hand tightly. "He can't have gone far." Emma scanned the chamber, her heart racing. There were no other exits, just the passage they'd entered through. She tried to call out to him, her voice bouncing off the walls, swallowed by the darkness. "Khalid!" Her voice echoed back to her, hollow and distant. "Maybe he's playing a prank," someone suggested weakly. But no one laughed. Instead, they all felt the same cold dread creeping up their spines. Emma took a shaky breath, trying to stay calm. "We should go back. He might be waiting for us outside." But as they turned to leave, they noticed something chilling. The entrance passage was gone. In its place was a solid stone wall. A woman gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. This can't be happening." The air grew colder. Shadows seemed to move along the walls, and the faint scent of incense filled the air. Emma stepped closer to the hieroglyphs she'd noticed earlier, the ones that had caught her attention before Khalid vanished. She brushed her fingers over them, her skin prickling at the cold touch of the stone. The symbols didn't just tell a story. They seemed to be alive, changing, shifting before her eyes. Her heart pounded as the carvings twisted, forming shapes that looked hauntingly familiar. A group of figures standing in a dark chamber, trapped, afraid. "It's us," she whispered, horrified. "The hieroglyphs. They're showing us." Another tourist, a young man named Liam, stepped forward. "That's impossible. They're just old carvings. This is probably some kind of illusion, right?" But even as he spoke, he saw it too. The figures on the wall grew more detailed, showing a man, a guide, just like Khalid, standing among them before vanishing into the stone. "He was the last guide who disappeared here," a voice whispered, seemingly from nowhere. Emma whipped around, but no one had spoken. Fear settled in her bones. She knew they had to get out, but there was no clear way. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness thickening like a veil. Emma touched the cold stone again, searching for any sign of an exit. Instead, the carvings changed once more, displaying a new scene, one that made her stomach drop. Each figure on the wall had met a different fate. Some slumped over, others seemingly scratching at the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. The elderly man who had spoken earlier grabbed Emma's arm, his face pale. "It's showing us what will happen to us, isn't it?" Emma couldn't answer. Her heart pounded as she stared at the carvings. They were trapped in this tomb, their fates written in stone. "Number, this isn't real," Liam insisted, though his voice shook. "We can find a way out. We just have to stay calm." But as he stepped forward, his foot slipped and he stumbled. The others reached out to help him, but he stared at the ground in horror. There, scratched into the stone, were fresh hieroglyphs, symbols showing a figure falling, just as he had done moments ago. "It's predicting everything we do," Emma realized, horror twisting in her chest. She felt the walls tighten around them, shadows stretching out like hands, reaching for them. They tried retracing their steps, but the layout of the tomb had changed. Every turn led to another chamber, each identical, yet somehow different, darker, colder, with the hieroglyphs showing them visions of terror and despair. As they wandered, exhausted and panicked, they passed a wall covered in more carvings. This time, the symbols showed an exit, an open doorway, sunlight streaming through. It felt like a promise, a glimpse of freedom. Emma felt hope flare in her chest. "Look, there's a way out." But as they moved toward it, the symbols on the wall shifted, and the exit vanished, replaced by an endless corridor. The carvings now showed each of them lost in the darkness, alone and terrified. "No!" Emma shouted, pounding her fist against the stone. "You can't keep us here!" But her voice only echoed back, swallowed by the silence. Suddenly, she noticed a faint flicker of light down the hall. barely visible but unmistakably there. The group moved toward it, hearts pounding, desperate for any sign of escape. But as they approached, the light flickered, showing the figure of Khalid, standing in the shadows. "Khalid!" Emma cried, relief flooding her voice. But as she drew closer, her relief turned to horror. Khalid's face was blank, his eyes empty, staring straight ahead as though he couldn't see them. His mouth opened, but his voice was hollow, distant, like an echo from another world. "You are where you belong," he intoned, his voice void of any warmth. "The tomb has chosen you." The light flickered, and Khalid vanished, leaving only darkness behind. Panic broke over them, and they ran, stumbling through the endless chambers, each passage twisting, leading them in circles. The hieroglyphs shifted with every step, showing each of their faces etched into the stone, surrounded by shadows. One by one, the group faltered, exhausted, until only Emma was left, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pressed her back against the wall, staring at the hieroglyphs that seemed to watch her, to record her every fear, every desperate thought. And then, in the silence, she heard it. A soft scratching sound, like someone carving into stone. She looked down and saw the wall beside her, her own hand moving, scratching out symbols she couldn't understand. She tried to stop, but her fingers wouldn't obey, her hand moving of its own accord, etching her own fate into the wall. As the darkness closed in, Emma realized with a sickening certainty that they were part of the tomb now, their fates carved in stone, bound to the ancient walls, forever part of the unending story. The tomb had claimed them, just as it had done for centuries, leaving only the whisper of hieroglyphs to tell their tale. And as the darkness fades, remember, the real chills linger long after the story's end. Until next time, brave souls.